This video is going to cover section 1.5 for statistics, and it talks about bias. So no matter how good you are when you're getting your sample and doing all of your stuff, sometimes bias happens. What bias is when your sample or your results don't actually represent the population. Don't represent population. So there's lots of reasons or ways this could happen, and I'm going to talk about those. That's what this section talks about. So one thing is sampling bias. So something is wrong with either the sample or how you got the sample. So either the sample or the process of getting the sample favors one part of the population. So maybe I did a simple random sample at school and I asked 20 kids and somehow 15 out of those 20 kids ended up being freshmen. Even though the sample process was correct, the actual sample itself biased. It had more freshmen than it should have. Or it could be the process. Maybe I used a convenience sample, and in that convenience sample, I'm favoring a certain group of people. One specific kind of sampling bias is undercoverage, and that's when a specific portion of the population is smaller in the sample than in reality. So we talked about like the stratified samples and how you want those to be representative of the percents. So if you should have had 50% of this group, but in your sample you only had 20%, you're undercovering the percentage that you should have. Another type is, so you can have non-response bias or response bias. So the sampling was within the actual sample or how you did the sample. Now, non-response and response are based on the answers. So non-response is when people that were in the sample don't respond. So if I ask 100 people, but only 50 respond, I'm missing 50% of the people's opinions. So it's important that you get your whole sample to respond. Some ways to mitigate that is you can try calling back. So if it's a survey, that's why people call you like 100 times on the phone to ask you about a survey, because you ended up in the sample, they really want your feedback. Sometimes they're rewards. Hey, I'll give you $5 if you complete this survey. Maybe there's a cover letter. If it's something sent in the mail, there's a cover letter explaining why this is important. Those are different ways to try to get people to respond to prevent the non-response bias. Response bias is when the sample answers don't accurately reflect the population's opinion. Again, lots of reasons this could happen, but somehow the answers we got in the sample aren't kicking back and reflecting what the real population is. This could happen for several reasons. One is interviewer error. So maybe the interviewer is not trained or comfortable. So they ask questions in a funny way, or they're nervous and people are uncomfortable so they don't answer right. Or maybe it's someone they don't trust. Someone they trust. So for example, if your boss is asking you about things that you like or dislike about your job, and you know they really like something because they created it, you may not be as honest when you answer them simply because the interviewer is your boss. It's not a secret, it's not private, so you might not actually represent yourself correctly because of the person interviewing. You may have, misrepresented answers. So if maybe it's a really like polarizing topic, people may lie or stretch the truth to make themselves sound better. It could be a wrong estimate. It may not even be on purpose. If I say, hey, how many times did you drive to Portland this year? I could estimate wrong and just give you the wrong answer on accident. It's not always intentional. So sometimes those answers change the results. Wording of the questions can matter. So sometimes if you say, do you favor versus do you oppose, people, if it's a yes or no question, might say yes instead of whether it's a favor or oppose. So you would want to give them choice. If the question's vague, if it's hard to understand the question, you might answer something different than what you think you're answering. Inflammatory words. So if your words are saying, hey, do you think we should fix this piece of junk road? That might get more people to say yes than just, do you think we should fix this road? So the wording of the question can change people's answers instead of their actual beliefs. Ordering of the questions or word. So prior questions could affect how you feel, how you respond. So if I'm asking questions about certain things, people might respond one way. But if I then put something in front of that question that makes it sound worse, I might change my response. For example, if I ask someone, do you believe in abortion? Do you support the woman's right to have an abortion? Some people are just going to say yes or no. If I said, do you believe in rape? Do you think this should be a consequence for rape? And then I ask about abortion. Someone who said no before might say yes now because now they're thinking about it as a rape victim instead of just in general. So that ordering can affect people's answers. And then finally, for your response, the question type can change the answers. So an open-ended question lets you give your own response, any response. Now, the benefit of that is you have more variety. There's lots of ways people can answer, but it also requires more analysis. It's more work to figure out your answers and group them and organize them. You could also organize them wrong. That's another type of bias. So the other option is your closed or limited responses. Do you favor or oppose? How many? You can only give certain numbers. This is easier to analyze, easier analysis, because you already have all of the options. But sometimes the answers don't truly reveal, may not truly represent how people think. So instead, they're picking the closest option, and that isn't necessarily accurate. So those are a bunch of different types of response bias, where the bias in your information comes from how people respond. Now we're going to go into data entry. That's another way you can get bias. So after you do this information, you have to put it somewhere. So I could mistype. I might type a number wrong, and that's going to change my data. I could enter something in the wrong spot, and that's going to change my data. So if I'm asking a bunch of data, number questions, but then I put the numbers in the wrong column, now those numbers are off because they're not representing the answer. Not necessarily anybody's fault. You could have had a perfect sample. You could have had great data that all of that was avoided, but if it's typed wrong, it's going to be interpreted wrong. So those are some different types. So we've talked about where the sampling error comes in. We've talked about how not getting responses or different things that could affect the responses. We've talked about data. So now another way to break down the error is a non-sampling error or a sampling error. So a sampling error, and these are kind of backwards from how I'm going to talk about it, but the sampling error just happens because we use a sample, because we're not asking everybody. We are not asking everybody. You can have a representative sample that perfectly represents the percentages and everything. Your questions can be perfect. You can get everyone to answer, but you're not asking every person. These 20 people might have different responses than those 20 people. And just by the nature of that, sometimes that group, even if it is ideal, isn't going to represent perfectly. We can't be perfect. So a sampling error comes from the fact that we're using samples. A non-sampling error is when something goes wrong. Something went wrong. So that could be from getting your sample, that could be from the data entry, that could be from the non-response. It just means something in the process went wrong. So that's an error that's not from sampling, it's from how the process happened. So again, a lot of vocab, a lot of little things that are weird without a situation in front of you, but that is section 1.5. Let me know if you have any questions.